The Biden administration mismanaged American leadership around the world. Well, here's one very significant indicator. The Saudi Kingdom, Saudi Arabia reportedly considering accepting Chinese currency instead of US dollars for its oil sales to China. This would be a huge change. Saudis are a great example of poor foresight and strategic planning. The administration was very tough on the Saudis, and yes, the murder of Jamal Khashoggi was an abomination. But on the other hand, if you're going to end up needing them and asking them for help, maybe you should have think about how you approach them. In recent years, the United States has found its influence tested on nearly every front. The America First approach that once promised renewed national strength has in practice begun to isolate the nation from the very alliances that once amplified its global reach. Tariffs on Chinese imports, the reconfiguration of trade deals, and a steady withdrawal from multilateral commitments have sent ripples through international politics. The result is a perception among allies that Washington is no longer a dependable partner, but rather a power acting on its own timetable and terms. For decades, Saudi Arabia stood among America's most trusted allies. The partnership was cemented through shared oil interests, vast arms deals, and a strategic understanding that stability in the Middle East required close coordination. Saudi intelligence, regional influence, and financial ties helped secure America's position in the region, while U.S. weapons and defense commitments safeguarded the kingdom from external threats. But that understanding is beginning to shift beneath the surface of diplomatic visits and ceremonial handshakes. A subtle recalibration is underway. During Trump's visit to Riyadh, the optics of unity, lavish receptions, multi-billion-dollar contracts, and renewed pledges of friendship masked an underlying tension. The Saudi leadership, watching Washington's unpredictable foreign policy unfold, began asking difficult questions about the sustainability of an exclusive alliance with the United States. In an era defined by trade wars and rising tariffs, relying solely on one partner, no matter how powerful, has started to look risky. That growing sense of uncertainty is steering Saudi Arabia toward an alternative: China. The kingdom's engagement with Beijing has expanded far beyond symbolic gestures. Major infrastructure projects, energy partnerships, and technology investments are increasingly being developed with Chinese participation. Officially, Riyadh maintains its allegiance to the United States, but its foreign policy is no longer one-sided. A balancing act has begun, one that reflects a broader recognition that power in the 21st century no longer flows from a single source. A turning point arrived when Washington announced sweeping 100% tariffs on Chinese imports set to take effect on November 1st. The move sent shock waves through global markets and drew immediate attention in Riyadh. According to several insiders, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman privately criticized the decision, calling for respect among nations' interests rather than economic confrontation. But the words were only part of the message. Reports suggest that Saudi officials went further, offering China alternative trade routes to offset the potential fallout from the tariffs. For the Trump administration, this was more than diplomatic disagreement. It was a warning. One of America's most loyal allies had not only voiced concern, but had taken steps to help its rival adapt. It revealed a pragmatic Saudi approach, preparing for a world where reliance on the U.S. alone could be a strategic vulnerability. The move did not provoke an immediate response from Washington, but behind the scenes, analysts and policymakers began taking note. Saudi Arabia remains tied to the U.S. in many ways. Security guarantees, defense cooperation, and access to American technology continue to be cornerstones of the relationship. But the once unquestioned dominance of U.S. influence is beginning to erode. When nations start hedging their bets, it reflects a deeper realization that the old framework of global power is being rewritten. The growing divide highlights a broader trend. America's current economic strategy, marked by tariffs, isolationism, and transactional diplomacy, has alienated partners who once benefited from its leadership. In contrast, China has approached global influence through infrastructure, trade, and technological cooperation. Its Belt and Road Initiative stretches across continents, offering investments instead of ultimatums. And for countries like Saudi Arabia, this kind of partnership holds tangible appeal. The transition is not abrupt. It is happening slowly through 1,000 small decisions that accumulate into a larger shift. But each one contributes to a reality where Washington's ability to dictate terms is fading. The days when the United States could reshape global alliances at will are drawing to a close. American policymakers recognize this. Discussions about restoring trust, rebuilding partnerships, and reasserting influence have grown louder. Yet so far, visible action has lagged behind the rhetoric. The trade war between the United States and China has become the defining catalyst of this transformation. What began as an economic confrontation has evolved into a structural shift in global strategy. Saudi Arabia, recognizing the permanence of this rivalry, has started taking steps once unthinkable. According to sources linked to the Saudi National Security Council, specialized teams have been established to explore the possibility of conducting portions of oil trade in Chinese yuan instead of US dollars. 5 years ago, that would have sounded inconceivable. Today, it reflects a serious reconsideration of the financial order. Reports from major outlets like Reuters and The Economist reveal that Riyadh and Beijing are discussing pilot programs for settling oil payments in digital yuan, especially for deliveries to Asian markets. Officially, these talks are presented as logistical experiments meant to improve efficiency. But beneath that diplomatic language lies a deeper signal, the beginning of an alternative to the dollar-based trade system that has defined global finance for decades. Such developments are not being ignored in Washington. Internal sources at the State Department confirm that the Trump administration is drafting reports for the National Security Council assessing how the trade war could weaken the dollar's dominance in the Persian Gulf. Leaked information obtained by journalists at the Financial Times indicates that the phrase threat of losing trust has appeared in official memoranda for the first time. The tone suggests growing unease within the White House about the reliability of one of its cornerstone partnerships. Meanwhile, China continues to strengthen its presence. High-ranking Chinese delegations have become regular visitors in Riyadh, presenting offers that combine technology, investment, and strategic cooperation. Through the Belt and Road Initiative, Beijing is inviting Saudi Arabia to take part in projects that could redefine trade routes between Asia and the Middle East, independent of U.S. participation. The South China Morning Post reports that these plans include massive transport corridors and logistics hubs that, if realized, could alter global trade dynamics for decades to come. For Washington, these developments represent more than a diplomatic inconvenience. They are a direct challenge to its historical influence in the region. Yet, instead of seeking common ground, the response has often been rooted in pressure. Threats to suspend arms deliveries, reevaluate defense cooperation, and reconsider protection agreements have been floated as leverage, but such tactics are losing effectiveness. The Guardian notes that ultimatums fail when alternatives exist, and Saudi Arabia's growing relationship with China provides exactly that. The kingdom now has access to an alternative source of capital, technology, and political support. Beijing's vast resources offer Riyadh confidence that it can withstand potential economic fallout from distancing itself from Washington. As this confidence grows, America's reputation as an indispensable partner weakens. The old equation where American weapons, technology, and markets secured loyalty no longer holds the same power when another superpower offers similar advantages without demanding ideological alignment. Across the broader global stage, this shift is part of a larger pattern. Countries that once feared U.S. sanctions or isolation are learning how to operate around them. Chinese banks are building parallel payment networks. Regional trade in yuan is expanding. And European corporations continue to engage with Beijing despite American warnings. Each step further normalizes a multipolar world where U.S. dominance is contested. Trump's rhetoric of national resurgence plays well to domestic audiences, but abroad it raises doubts about whether America's strength lies in confrontation or cooperation. Power today is not measured by how many aircraft carriers patrol the seas or how many tariffs can be imposed, but by the ability to keep allies aligned. And this is where Washington's biggest challenge now lies. If these trends continue, the world could witness a fundamental realignment of global alliances. Old partnerships may weaken as new ones form, and influence may shift toward those capable of offering stability without coercion. America, long accustomed to being the central force in world affairs, could find itself adapting to a reality where it is one of several major players rather than the unchallenged leader. In this evolving landscape, the relationship between Washington and Riyadh serves as a striking example of how policy decisions ripple far beyond economics. A trade war framed as a domestic victory has become a global test of loyalty. The consequences are reshaping not only financial systems but also the architecture of international trust. And so the United States under Donald Trump, by centering on trade conflict and a policy increasingly indifferent to the needs of its allies, stands on the brink of losing its long-held dominance. Saudi Arabia is now one of the clearest examples of how a loyal partner begins to diversify its alliances. And China is poised to capitalize on that shift. If this course continues, the world may soon see a transformation in global geopolitics. Alliances redrawn, influence redistributed, and America, long the world's central power, reduced to being one player among many. Will Washington rebuild the bridges it burned? Or will this moment mark the point when the U.S. split its own foundation? Now, let's shift our focus to the United States and China. The long and turbulent trade war between the two economic giants intensified once again in February 2025, when President Donald Trump imposed sweeping tariffs on China, as well as on Canada and Mexico. What began years ago as a struggle for trade balance has now evolved into a full-scale economic standoff. Since those tariffs took effect on February 1st, both Washington and Beijing have been locked in a cycle of retaliation, with tariff rates at times reaching triple digits. Tensions eased slightly last week when Trump met Chinese leader Xi Jinping in South Korea for a round of high-stakes talks. After hours of negotiations, an agreement was reached. The United States would reduce tariffs on Chinese goods by 10%, while Beijing would take stronger action to curb the flow of fentanyl into America. Despite this modest breakthrough, the average tariff rate on Chinese imports remains around 47%. A stark reminder of how deeply the trade war has reshaped global commerce. Behind the diplomatic gestures lies a larger question. How is China actually performing under the weight of these tariffs? The numbers reveal a complex picture. Even before Trump's second term, China's exports to the United States had been declining steadily. That trend has now accelerated. In September, Chinese exports to the U.S. totaled $34.3 billion, down sharply from $47 billion in the same month last year, a 27% drop. But while trade with America has faltered, China's overall exports are far from collapsing. In fact, they've risen 6.1% this year, with September alone showing an 8.3% increase compared to the previous year. The reason is clear. China has diversified, redirecting its exports to other regions where trade remains open and growing. A similar trend has unfolded in the beef industry. China, which ranks as the third largest buyer of American beef, has scaled back its purchases dramatically. Between January and July this year, the country bought $481 million worth of U.S. beef, down 47% from the same period last year. Those imports now account for only 8% of total U.S. beef exports, compared to 15% a year ago. The reason is straightforward. Contracts between the two nations were not renewed, and China shifted its business to Australia and Argentina. Recent data from China's General Administration of Customs shows how steep that decline has become. In September, China imported $11 million worth of American beef, compared to $110 million in the same month last year, a staggering 90% drop. This rapid reorientation reflects China's broader economic strategy to ensure that no single country, not even the United States, holds decisive control over its key supply chains. The trade war that began as an economic maneuver has now turned into a geopolitical contest, one that reaches far beyond tariffs or trade figures. As China strengthens ties with new suppliers and trading partners, its global influence expands quietly but steadily. The U.S., meanwhile, faces a dilemma. Its economic pressure campaign has hurt Chinese exports to America, but has also accelerated Beijing's efforts to build alternative markets and alliances, forcing both nations to adapt to a reality neither can fully control. Because this is exactly where Washington faces its most serious problems today. What do you think about all this? Tell us in the comments. Before you leave, Subscribe to our channel and we will see you in the next.